Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. There's been a lot of speculation in Zimbabwe's social media. This idea that the army is the kingmaker in Zimbabwe. Nothing could be further from the truth. The problem is Zimbabweans sometimes we tend to read more than what is there. We want a certain narrative. And sometimes we see it, even when it's not there. This idea that the army is one of the most powerful stakeholders in Zimbabwe politics has circulated and recirculated and it's becoming pathetic. The truth is, it's not. Let's just listen to this video clip. Jealous Mawari talking on that subject.
The civil society, and that includes the army, because the problem in this country is the army. The army is the one that moved in and took over Zanu PF. Mangwana does not belong to Zanu PF. Zanu PF belongs to the army because the army moved in on the 15th of November, and we are favored by the reasons why they moved in. They wrote, the so-called command element of the army moved in, and they have signed the minutes. They said, we are moving in because we have realized that Zanu PF is going to lose the election, so we are going to take over Zanu PF from Mugabe and those that support him. So the army imposed someone who had been chased away from Zanu PF, imposed him as the president. And that person then called an illegitimate election. So the problem that we have is a constitutional crisis that needs every one of us. I expect General Valerio Sivanda to be among us here. I expect General Chiwenga in his full military gear. Don't be fooled by hearing that he's the VP. No, he's a soldier. We expect Sibusiso Moyo to be here in his full military gear. And we begin actually to get to hear their concerns. Why they moved in to take over Zanu PF, why they moved in to take over the state, why they moved in to take over government. And until we do that, we are never going to have sustainable peace in this country. The hallmark of foolishness is doing one thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We did that in 2008, ignored the army and had political parties negotiate something that was not sustainable. 7 or less than 10 years down the line, the same army moved in and took over power. So we need the army. We need to dialogue with the army. Zimbabwe is actually another Sudan.
The truth of the matter is that is not true. Zanu PF, Robert Mugabe and Mnangagwa specifically are the ones who invited the army, the police, the CIO, the prison services, and the war veterans to play an increasingly partisan political role in Zimbabwe. They needed those guys to play that role to further Zanu PF's ambition of creating a de facto one-party state. They are the ones who created the so-called Joint Operations Command, the junta that has been the power behind the regime. But as much as the army would want to pretend that they were in charge. They were only doing what Mugabe and Mnangagwa told them, the political masters told them. I've often played this video clip of one of the army commanders talking about they will not salute anyone without Liberation War credentials. Listen to him.
We wish to make it very clear to all Zimbabwean citizens that the security organization will only stand in support of those political leaders that will pursue Zimbabwe's value, traditions, belief, for which thousands of lives were lost in pursuit of Zimbabwe's hard-won independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the national interest. To this end, let it be known that the highest office on the land is a straitjacket.
Well, if the truth be told, he was only parroting the words that Mugabe and his cronies had told him. He was the one wearing the straitjacket. He had to say those things in the interest of propping up Zanu PF. The same applies to the top brass in the army, in the police, the CIO, Prison Services, the war veterans. Everybody knows that Zanu PF politicized those institutions, turning them into nothing more than departments of Zanu PF. And when Zanu PF needed propping up, they stepped in to do their duty. Here is another senior army official singing for his dinner.
Zanu PF itatonga kusika madonge ameranya. Muchida musingadi. Ameni. Apanda kutaura sa Commander Army. Shashandisa inonzi Command 40. Yes. Yeah. Yayaye masapuku wariti wemusanga chazvigadzira. Yes. Amen. Mnangagwa, pasi nemandu. Security forces saka PC mkuru wemauto ndini.
That character was none other than Anselmo Sanyatwe, who was recently demoted, stripped of his Zimbabwe National Army command position and made a Minister of Sport and Arts. If the army was the one calling the shots, he would have never been stripped of his position. If you want to see that the army actually did not command, are not the ones who are calling the shots in Zimbabwe, but we are rather being used by Zanu PF. You only have to look at what happened in 2008. When the March election results were coming out, and Zanu PF realized that they were losing big time, what Mnangagwa did was to call the Joint Operations Command top brass. And their instructions was to take over the SEC. The SEC was told to stop announcing the results, and the Joint Operations Command went on to take another 6 weeks to announce those results. Only 5 million people had voted. Why it took 6 weeks, of course, is because they were cooking up the results. And the last result to be announced was the presidential result. Tsvangirai, 73% vote, according to Mugabe, was whittled down to 47%. Enough to force the runoff. And during the runoff, Joint Operations Command carried out Operation Mavoterapapi, a military-style operation whose primary purpose was to punish the people of Zimbabwe for having dared to reject the Zanu PF in the March vote. The army, the CIO, the police, the prison services, the war veterans, they all did their part in Operation Mavoterapapi. But cannot be any doubt at all who was responsible. Mnangagwa, Zanu PF. And Mnangagwa himself has boasted about it. It's not as if it's a secret. But when SADC and the AU refused to accept those results and give Zanu PF legitimacy, it fell back to the politicians, Mugabe and his Zanu PF cronies, to negotiate and sign the 2008 Global Political Agreement, which accepted the GNU. The army, the police, the CIO, the war veterans had no say in the negotiations of the Global Political Agreement, nor did they have any say in what was to happen during the GNU. As we know, MDC failed to implement even one token democratic reform in those 5 years, including reforms which would have severed the umbilical cord linking Zanu PF to the army, to the police, to the CIO, to the war veterans, etc., etc. MDC leaders' failure to implement even one token reform was not a result of what the army or anybody else did. It was because Mugabe bribed the MDC leaders with the trappings of high office, and they forgot about the reforms. Period. The army played no part in it. None. So we should not try to pretend that the army is all powerful. It's not. The army was invited into politics by Zanu PF, corrupted, in fact, by Zanu PF. And those army generals have always been wearing a straight jacket with the Zanu PF leader's head on it. We had Sanyatwe there making the slogan praising Zanu PF. And we know that the army were behind the violence, for instance, of the 1st August. But it wasn't them. They were only doing Zanu PF leaders' bidding. I believe that the recent Geza uprising, which fizzled to nothing, failed because the army was divided. Unlike 2017, during the coup, the army stop brass supported one faction. The police and the CIO supported another faction. The war veterans, I think many people would say probably the majority supported the Mnangagwa faction. And so the outcome of that factional war divided the army as much as it divided all the other securocrats. It just so happened that the majority of the army sided with the Lacoste faction. And hence the reason why they prevailed. The Geza uprising, the army, I think, was divided. The police probably supported the Mnangagwa faction, and so did the CIO. The war veterans, some supported Geza faction, but Mnangagwa was very quick to move in with all these bribes, building these 3-roomed matchboxes in the rural areas for the war veterans, making sure that there's a borehole and giving them a bicycle. Basic things that if the economy was doing well, one would expect, but no one would wait for 45 years to get some of those basic necessities of life. They would have done them for themselves. But with the economic situation in Zimbabwe, those war veterans are lucky that they've got those matchboxes, and they've got a borehole, and they've got a bicycle. And I think they also know that those bribes come at a price. They must continue to support Mnangagwa. If any of those war veterans who got those gifts should be suspected of supporting the Geza faction, I think we all know that those individuals will find themselves being stripped matchbox will be taken away from them. The whole borehole, if it's not sabotaged, it may even be sabotaged. That is the reality. They must be seen to be wearing Zanu PF straight jackets with Mnangagwa's face on it, because it was the Mnangagwa faction that drilled the boreholes for them. So the politicization of these security services departments has always been part and parcel of this Zanu PF politics. But we should not make the mistake of believing that they are the ones who are leading Zanu PF. They may be the ones carrying the gun, but they're not calling the shots. That is the argument. We could have had a democratic Zimbabwe if Morgan Tsvangirai and his MDC friends had not sold out during the JNU. If they had gone ahead and implemented the democratic reforms. They failed to implement even one reform. And hence, the reason why we are where we are. We can still dismantle this Zanu PF dictatorship. Indeed, in the 2023 elections, MDC, CCC should not have participated in those flawed elections, knowing fully well that the process is flawed, and knowing fully well that participating would give Zanu PF legitimacy. But they did out of greed. I've often quoted this quotation from David Coulter's book. That is at the heart of Zimbabwe's failed political system. Greed. We have an opposition that is corrupt, incompetent, and utterly useless. And we blame the army for the failure, the country's failure to end this Zanu PF dictatorship. No. The army had no role in that. They were used, yes. They too have got a lot to protect because they know, for instance, their involvement in the 2008 Operation Mafotera Papi left some of them knowing fully well that what they were doing was serious treason. Just as much as the coup itself of 2017. That is serious treason. And when you have committed treason, of course, you have got an invested interest in making sure that the regime that comes in will protect you from facing justice. So after the 2017 military coup, for instance, it is natural that those who were involved in the coup wanted to take up political positions. And they wanted to make sure that Zanu PF wins the elections. because losing would have meant some of them being roundly arrested in the small hours of the morning and being charged with treason. So they had to make sure that they are part of the political system. But they were already in Zanu PF. And being part of Zanu PF, when there was factional fighting, they had no choice but to take sides. But to come back to the situation now, can Zimbabwe's political situation, political crisis, political paralysis be resolved without consulting the army? The answer is yes. If CCC had not participated in the 2023 elections, given that they knew the process is flawed, they also knew that by participating, they're only giving Zanu PF legitimacy. If they had not participated, and we still had not conned millions of their supporters to participate, I believe SADC and the AU, who condemned those elections as flawed, would have gone one step further and deny Zanu PF political legitimacy. They did not take that extra step for the simple reason that Zimbabweans had participated in those flawed elections in their millions. And that the other reason is when CCC leaders decided to take up their seats post the elections, even when they knew SADC and the AU had condemned the process, that left SADC and the AU with no choice but to walk away. They did not endorse Zanu PF's victory, nor did they deny Zanu PF's political legitimacy. So if the people had not participated in their millions, if the opposition had not taken up their seats, SADC would have denied Zanu PF political legitimacy. And that would have forced Zanu PF, not the army, not the police, not the CIO, not the war veterans, to sign another global political agreement. And formation of another GNU, and hopefully this time a GNU which will focus on the primary purpose of the GNU, to implement the democratic reforms, to end the culture of rigged elections. That is true. And I think by pretending that we cannot do anything without involving the army, that is a distraction. We don't want to face the political realities that MDC had the golden opportunity to implement the reforms, and they failed to do so, even when they had the golden opportunity to do so. The fact that MDC, CCC sold out on reforms does not mean no one else is competent to implement those reforms, much less that we no longer need the reforms. We do. The opportunity to get those reforms implemented are still there. We do not need to keep on participating in flawed elections, for one thing. We just don't have the competent opposition leaders who can get this mess sorted out. Like I said, just because Tsvangirai and company sold out during the GNU does not mean we do not have competent Zimbabweans who can implement the reforms. And to pretend that no, nothing can move, we need the army to be involved in the dialogue, is just a feeble excuse for MDC's failure to implement reforms, and for the present opposition leaders' lack of vision to get those reforms implemented. Think about it. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.